Thank you for joining us today. As we've often discussed, there's a lot more to law school than the classroom, than the books. We have the public service programs, the externships you do outside law school that really help you understand how the world works and the difference a lawyer can make in someone's life. And then we have this distinguished speaker series and all of the lunch and learn programs that our Career Services Office puts on that brings people from the world to you to share their perspectives and broaden all of our perspectives. And today it's my pleasure to introduce a very special person to perform that role. Professor Charles Ogletree is the Jesse Klemenko Professor of Law and Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard University. Through his many path-breaking books, his dozens of articles and book chapters, the public television series on justice that he has moderated, and his role as counsel or network commentator for some of the major cases of our day, he has become one of our nation's leading voices on our criminal justice system, on our educational system, on the impact of race on our justice system, and the challenge of revitalizing America's cities. He began his career with 8 years as a public defender, and since then has gone on to win dozens of national awards honoring him for his commitment to justice, for his commitment to civil rights, and his commitment to educational opportunity for all. Today, he will speak on the role of President Obama in pursuing a post-racial America. And he is uniquely suited to discuss this topic. As a law professor, he was law professor and advisor to both President Obama and Mrs. Obama while they were in law school. Since then, he has been involved in their campaigns, involved in their successes, and is currently writing a book about President Obama and his accomplishments. So we have with us one of the leading voices in America on justice. I'm very proud to introduce him. Please join me in welcoming Professor Charles Ogletree.
Thanks so much, Dean Ray. I'm very pleased to be here at St. Thomas Law School, and I want to thank Professor Lawson for the invitation and for all of you for coming out today. I wanted to say a few things about the President, the First Lady, the White House, and what all that means, and what it means for us as we think about it. This is a generation of people that I would call the post-Obama period. You're in law school after he's been elected for a second term, and may or may not have participated in voting in 2008, but I'm going to take a few steps backward and then take a few steps forward. And let me just say this before I get into the essence of what I want to say. A lot of people don't clearly understand the history of President Obama, and I'm going to try to put that into context. This is not a cheerleading section about the President and what he's done. And the Dean mentioned that I am writing a book. I was trying to keep it confidential, but now it's public. So I'm going to be writing a book, and it's tentatively titled Understanding Obama. And as someone who's known him since the 1980s and still are involved with him well in the 21st century, I hope to cover all those periods and to say what I think is the promise that he showed in the 20th century as a student, as well as some of the challenges he's faced in the 21st century as a senator, as the first African-American elected president, and then his election the second term and how things, in my view, have changed. And part of it is the complexity of race, and whether, how, and when, and why not has he discussed the issue of race. or decided not to discuss it because it may not have played the right kind of role at the time. I first actually met Michelle Obama, and it's important to contextualize his relationship with her and how that fits into his role as senator and ultimately as president. Michelle and her brother both went to Princeton University for college. She followed her brother there. Her brother's now a coach, a basketball coach in the state of Oregon. There she wrote a really remarkable thesis as a senior, in a sense, assessing the views of African Americans who had attended Princeton before she attended Princeton, and talking about their views about it. And a lot of people have misinterpreted that piece as, in a sense, her own reflections on race, but it was her views about many others. It's also important to note that having had the chance to be a mentor to her when she came to Harvard in 1985 and when she graduated in 1988, if you were to ask me back then, what do I think about Michelle Obama, what would she do? I was very impressed with her as a student. She was well organized. She was one of the leading students at Harvard's Legal Aid Bureau, which meant that in addition to all their academic classwork, they spent much of their time in the second and third year advising, representing, consulting with clients in civil legal matters. And these were folks who could not afford to have a lawyer, but who needed a law student as a lawyer to handle their matters. And she was incredibly effective and engaging in what she was able to do, always well prepared, always well dressed, incredibly articulate in what she had to say. It made a big difference. And so if you were to ask me in the 1980s, what do I think about Michelle Robinson, her maiden name, I would have told you there was no doubt in my mind that she was going to be the first African-American woman to be elected in modern history to the United States Senate. She had that kind of skill, determination, and resolve in the 1980s. And she took a different path, but I was very convinced of that. She never met Barack Obama at Harvard Law School. She graduated in June of 1988, and he arrived in September 1988. They actually met when he spent his first summer of law school, after law school, in law school, going to Chicago. She was an associate at a law firm, and she took him out to a lunch to persuade him, as the partner had said, to join the firm. And she was talking about the many values of corporate law and why it was important for him to think about it and why he would be a great asset. And he was talking about whether he could have a date with her. He had a very different agenda than she did. And they were ultimately married in 1992. I knew Barack when he first arrived at Harvard Law School, and the one word that I would say that described him then and most of now is a collaborator. He was extremely gifted in his ability as a law student to not only exceed in the classroom, being older than many of the other students, being age 29 when he started, but gifted in his sharing of the podium, the sharing of the microphone, sharing of his space in the classroom with other students who he thought were equally gifted in some respects. And he wanted us as teachers to understand that even though he was smart, and he was incredibly smart and talented, that he was not the only one. And so he would answer a question and talk about various issues and discuss the transactional cost and everything else that might be relevant to the question. And then he would say, but Carol also made an important point, Professor, because she really pulled together the essence of the issue in this hypothetical, and she should be credited. And if you think about what Randolph said, Randolph really understood the nitty-gritty of this issue and was able to pull all the elements together and offer a broader complex. And if you think about Sarah, I mean, Sarah was really incredibly gifted in her ability to see how the nuances of this case is very different. And Ralph was, I said, wait, Barack, am I or you teaching this class? You know, this would be clear. But that was his gift, the idea to share it with everyone else because of his view about what it would make. That, I think, had a big role in him being elected as the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review. The Harvard Law Review's members are admitted based on both academic performance as well as other factors as well. And he was clearly one of the strongest individuals in his class, and the class members selected him as the president of the Harvard Law Review. And a lot of things happened then. One of the same thing about collaboration and the ability to give out responsibilities. He was highly regarded and respected by folks who disagreed with him ideologically on a whole host of issues. There are students who were extremely conservative who would identify themselves as Republicans, and he was then identified as a Democrat and as a moderate and maybe even a liberal. But his ability to get along with people made a big difference. And even though he may not have agreed with what you wanted to write, what your note was going to be about in the law review, that did not stop him from bringing in what he thought were the best and most effective aspects of that, and what would make a big difference in what people would be able to do. And so he was very excellent at that. And I think that made a big significance. And I'll get to in just a minute the issue of race and how that played into his role beyond Harvard. The first sort of broad racial context in which people evaluated him is that, and most people may not even remember this, there was a professor at Harvard Law School who was my teacher, my mentor, and ultimately my friend, who was the first African-American professor at Harvard Law School. That was Professor Derek Bell. He arrived at Harvard Law School in 1969, was tenured within a year, and stayed at Harvard. And he was there when I came in 1975. Very open to students, very demanding, but also very wise in what he had to say, and taught us to think about law in a different way. And had his own views, and one of them was interest convergence. I'll say more about that in the Q&A if it comes up. But the whole idea was to think about the theory of law in a different context. He taught constitutional law and race law and other courses as well, but a very astute scholar, a very published scholar, and very impressive. And when he first went on a strike, it was in the 1970s. He left Harvard because his point was, where are the other African-American tenured professors? While he was there, the law school did hire now the senior judge and former chief judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge Harry Edwards. He was a phenomenon. And at the same time, a Harvard graduate was hired. That's Judge Clarence Ferguson, who was also an ambassador as well. So there were 3 tenured black men on the faculty, but he thought that they had not done enough. So he left Harvard in 1981 out of protest and went to the University of Oregon, where he was appointed as the dean, University of Oregon Law School. And then when an Asian American woman came up for tenure who he supported and was not granted tenure, he started a protest and left Oregon in 1985 and came back to teach at Harvard. And that's the year that I started teaching as well. And so we were both colleagues. And it's one thing to say this, that Derek Bell couldn't keep a job. That's the unfair way to put it. But he left Harvard in the 1990 over a protest because Harvard had not tenured any women. And in fact, he was right. Harvard had not offered tenure to any women, and he left there in 1990. The person who introduced him at a rally about diversity at Harvard Law School was none other than Barack Obama, who was in his second year at Harvard Law School, very casual, well-liked by students, and talked about how Derek Bell in 1990 was, he called him, the Rosa Parks of the legal profession. So he understood, Obama, the value of race and someone who stood up for civil rights in the 1950s, and saw Derek Bell as a natural leader in that context as well. And so he left in 1990 and then went to teach at the New York University, NYU in New York. And he was there from 1990 and taught a number of courses, was well respected. And there wasn't much that Barack saw of him at that time. And in fact, Barack had taken no classes from Bell and really didn't know Bell, but he still introduced him in a very powerful thing that turned out to become a nightmare when he was running for president in 2012. I'll talk about that a little later. So who is Barack Obama and what are his views on race? And I would say that both are complicated. There is no simple answer. Meeting him as a young student, he clearly was bright, had great intentions, great abilities, had served before going to law school as a phenomenal community organizer in Chicago, and it worked in both ways. He was able to make sure that the community understood what it meant to vote, what it meant to have the benefits of a place to live, to have a job. He was very active in what he was doing. And that's one part of him, and people saw that as a valuable asset. And you may remember that when he was first running, people made jokes of, what's a community organizer? What kind of title is that? What does that mean? But that's what he did in his first part of his career before becoming a lawyer. And after being at Harvard, he was trying to decide what to do in terms of going back to Chicago. And we had a good conversation, and he asked, look, I'm in my third year at Harvard. I've done exceedingly well. I'm the president of Law Review. I have the right, like any other graduate, I can go and clerk for the Supreme Court, like every other president of Harvard Law Review, but I'm not going to do that. I have the right to go and work for a law firm and make $100,000 a year. I've earned that right because of my academic success here at a place like Harvard. But I've told the people of Chicago I'm going to come back and be a lawyer. I'm going to do public interest work. And can I do that? Can I give it up? And I said, Barack, yes, you can. Which became a theme for what he had to say for the next 20 years. He's never given me credit at all. I'm not complaining. I'm just making a point. The point is that if you think about yes, we can, this is an educational moment. People think it started with Barack Obama. It actually started, for me, decades earlier as a kid from California, Stanford undergraduate, very active in the movement of farm workers. And the first I heard of yes, we can was in Spanish, sí se puede. And that's because I marched as a high school student and then as a college student with Cesar Chavez in the fields of Delano and other parts of California, and Dolores Huerta, who was his right-hand person. And that was the whole idea of the movement. We may not have the rights of others who are working here, but we have the rights against pesticides. We have the rights against a working wage. We have the rights to protest and challenge, and that became part of it. And that became the same kind of mantra that we may recall from Obama's campaign. When he was a young state senator in Illinois, he came to me again in the early when he was back in Chicago about thinking about running for office and what that would mean. And he was kind enough to come to a reception that I was having for somebody else and talked about what that meant, that he wanted to be a public servant. And part of what people don't know, unless you've really followed YouTube and Google, is that he was a very aggressive politician. And he made it clear that there are a number of people who were serving in the state of Illinois who were state legislators, but who had not done all the work, didn't have the right signatures. And he was responsible for getting a lot of people off the ballot, a lot of African Americans who were incredibly successful and yet had not done the work necessary to be an important official. And so he was elected to the state senate. And if you go back and look at his record, what you see today is not materially different from what you saw when he was elected to the state senate. He was very concerned about health care. He was concerned as well about crime. And a lot of those things that you see, he's concerned about jobs. If you look at the things that he supported as a state senator, you'll see the same sort of remake in the terms of what he was doing for the Senate. He came into the view of most of us nationally, when he spoke at the Democratic National Convention in 2004. in July 2004. It was held in Boston. I got a chance to talk with him then. And you may remember John Kerry. No, he was never elected president. John Kerry wasn't. But John Kerry had him as his keynote speaker at the Democratic National Convention in 2004. And he was terrific. And he brought into that speech as well the things that made him the success that he was. You remember what he talked about? He talked about, my father is an African from Kenya. My mother is a white woman from Kansas. The whole idea that I am a product of people of different races, and they've come together and made an enormous amount of difference. That's what he talked about in 2004, and that's why he was so overwhelmingly successful. If you look at his speech, and I'm going to analyze it in the book that I'm writing, it's very interesting. Some will say it's a Democratic speech. People were crazy in Boston. They were just thrilled to hear this articulate, powerful, strong person speak, state senator. But in reality, if you look at it again, the speech was to not just the Democrats at this convention center in Washington and in Boston, but to Americans across. He talked about red states and blue states. He talked about the interests of the Democrats, but also the interests of Republicans, and how people might be concerned about gay rights and other issues. It doesn't matter who you are or where you are. It might be very different. So he talked about those things in very different contexts, and that made him, in my view, a very universal candidate as well in 2004. And then you may recall that what really sort of catapulted his campaign is that he understood the value of having a relationship beyond the normal division of the line. The Democrats sit on this side, the Republicans sit on that side. He was incredibly successful because he had a good relationship with Republican Senator Richard Lugar. And that made a big difference in his early context, because here Lugar said, let me show you around, let me make it happen. And people may not remember this, but even during that time when he was in the United States Senate, after being elected overwhelmingly in Illinois, he also met and was encouraged by, who else? Harry Reid, who was the largely unknown Democratic senator then in the early part of the 21st century. But it was Harry Reid who said, I think you can be the President of the United States. Early in 2000, right after 2004, between 2004 and 2007, Reid was urging him that he could do that, if that's something that he wanted to do. Joe Biden, who was also in the Senate, said the same thing, that this is a guy who has an incredible amount of talent. And they said things that now you look back, and Joe Biden said, Barack Obama would be great because he's clean. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean, but you can imagine it was divisive. What he was saying is that he wasn't a part of the civil rights movement, right? And Harry Reid talked about the fact that he was articulate and didn't speak in the Negro dialect unless he wanted to, right? And so the things had mixed messages, even though that was part of what he was trying to do. And that created an incredible amount of support. It was an uphill battle. If you go back and look in early 2008, in late 2007, it was clear that across the nation, there was one person who was going to be elected president. 3 people were candidates. One was Hillary Clinton, whose husband had served for 8 terms, Bill Clinton, 8 years for 2 terms. The other was John Edwards, the Democratic senator from the state of North Carolina. And the third was Barack Obama. And going into a largely African-American community in South Carolina and running for the Democratic nomination, it was tough because the black ministers and the black public officials said, look, the Clintons are from the South, and we support them. They have a history in politics. John Edwards' father was born in South Carolina, and so we have support for John Edwards as well. Barack Obama, we don't know who he is or where he's come from, so why would we support him? And he had the problem in 2007, 2008. People were saying, you know, he wasn't black enough. Right? That is, that what are his linkages to the African-American community that we can identify? And he turned that around very effectively in 2007, 2008 by what he said in South Carolina, the places that he went. And it's very interesting. If you look at what people thought in 2007, 2008, many people said, well, he's from Hawaii, he went to Harvard, he went to Columbia, he's biracial, he's probably married to a white woman. That's the hint that people would say around the barbershop and the beauty parlors in South Carolina. And then they met Michelle Obama. And the first thing she would say, girl, I need to take my shoes off in this beauty parlor. The whole sense that she was real. She was not only an African-American, but a black woman in South Carolina, and that made a difference. And I tell him now, I said, Barack, just appreciate it. You married up, man, like many of us. You married up. That's what happened. And I think that made a big difference in his own sense about what politics meant. But the idea of having both Michelle Robinson Obama and Barack Obama was a remarkable hit. If you go back and read, and some of you may have read Dreams from My Father, the first book that he wrote after he graduated from Harvard Law School, it's a very interesting piece, and people debate, and we can have the debate, whether he ever thought he was going to run for office, because it was incredibly candid. It was very much idealistic about what he's going to do. He told some stories that didn't need to be told about his mother, about his drug usage, about getting drunk, about his girlfriends, all those things. People say, well, he would never have told that if he's going to run for national office, because, that would stop him. Well, maybe he was thinking that I'm going to put it out now, and there's a test, and people will know that I'm normal, I'm human, I'm like everybody else. And it didn't turn out to be a major issue in the campaign. And so he runs for office against Hillary Clinton and against John Edwards. And if you remember the debates, if you go back and look at the first debates, you'll see it's very interesting that he's a fish out of water. He has no understanding about politics, raw politics. And you can see that because Hillary Clinton is familiar with it. She was responsible for, I think, the election of Bill Clinton as governor of Arkansas, and very much responsible for his role in the election of the President of the United States. She was that well endowed with abilities to make a big difference in his life, and that made Bill Clinton a great president that was elected overwhelmingly in 2 terms. And yet, you can see Barack Obama was sort of gaining because he had a strategy that no one had thought about. Even if you take a poll today, and it's no disrespect, I think there may be 6 of us here who are over 50. I am among those. But the idea is that young people don't vote, they're not interested in politics, so we're not going to spend any money or time. It's what many experienced politicians thought. And Barack Obama's view was just the opposite. Young people do vote. They're interested. They just haven't had a candidate that seems to be exciting them. And so he spent a lot of time, and you remember the hope message, the change message, those were part of it, that people could really, in a sense, grasp something short, sweet, topical that made an enormous amount of difference, and that's what he did in the campaign. And gradually, if you look at the polls, it's very interesting. Hillary Clinton is amazingly leading with Barack very much behind her all of 07, and then you see about February 08 when they started debating, you see the change. Barack goes up, Hillary Clinton goes down, and so he won that primary. And then the same sort of appeal that young people, diverse people, made an enormous amount of difference. And you think about it, there were no discussions, no open discussions about race. It just wasn't in the papers. And then finally, in November 2008, he won overwhelmingly against John McCain. And everybody said, wow, we've elected the first African-American president. Now, Bill Clinton for 8 years was known as the first African-American president, right? And he accepted that, right? He says, because Toni Morrison had written a piece about him that said, Barack Obama is like Bill Clinton. And she wasn't saying because he's the first black president. She was saying Bill Clinton has all those problems, with another woman, with a whole series of problems that worth taking a look at. But when he was elected in 2008, it brought not only the country together in terms of what he won, over 50% of the vote, and won in states that had not been won by Democrats before, including this state, which has been a very important aspect for Obama's election in 2008, and other places in the South. And let me give you one example that people may not have known that made a big difference. The president won the state of North Carolina in 2008. Now, what's interesting about it is this. If you watch the election on the date of the election, I think it's November 8th, November, whatever it was, in 2008, if you watch the actual date and the votes start being tallied, he lost the election on the date of the election in 2008. But over 200 African Americans had voted early, because you can allow to do that in North Carolina, and with the 200,000 early votes tabulated with the votes on the date of the election in 2008, he won by something like 12,000 votes because of the organization in the state of North Carolina that made an enormous amount of difference. And so that's what propelled him over as well. Everybody celebrated his success. When I say everybody, generally you look around, it was a message to the black community that it was incredibly successful, a message to the white community that here's a guy who has all the talents and abilities, et cetera, that makes an enormous amount of difference. And it just went off in 2008 in terms of his success. And then if you also look at what he did, it was a number of things that happened between the first term and second term that, in a sense, crystallized his commitment to diversity. You may or may not remember it, but he appointed the first African-American Attorney General, and that was Eric Holder in 2009. He appointed the first woman ever, and women represent more than 50% of the legal profession, but the first woman ever to be the Solicitor General, the highest-ranking lawyer in our legal system in America. And that was Elena Kagan, and she was only 50 years old, or in fact younger than 50 when she was appointed. She had never argued before the Supreme Court. She'd never argued any appellate court, but she was a terrific Solicitor General. He also had the opportunity to appoint two women to the Supreme Court, two people to the Supreme Court, and he appointed both women. First, a woman of color, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and later Elena Kagan. And so you could see some of that progress in terms of him trying to say, I've had to respond to it. So what was the problem? The problem was that people began to say, wait a minute, you're an African-American president, where are the African Americans? Where are they in your cabinet? Where are they in the Supreme Court? Where are the African-American women? Where are the sense of, we voted for you? And the numbers were overwhelming in terms of the African-American vote. It was overwhelming in 2008 because it made an enormous amount of difference in what he was able to do. Let me just say this in moving forward. He made it even more powerful as he went forward and started thinking about, let me see what the second term is going to look like. And then something happened. The economy just went crazy. We were losing hundreds of thousands of jobs during his first term. And most of that pain was in the African-American community. Although the employment rate was high 7s and 8%, it was double that in the African-American community. And so from 2008 to 2012, you asked the question that President Reagan always asked, and a very good question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And that he was talking about Jimmy Carter from 1976 to 80 when he ran in 1980. And if the African-American community had to answer that question honestly about 2008 to 2012, the answer would be, no, we're not better off. We don't have jobs. We don't have homes. We have crime in our community. We have incredible problems. We don't have education in our schools and our children. And so the black community was incredibly disadvantaged because of the president not using his bully pulpit. I'm not saying he could create jobs, but he could use the bully pulpit to make it happen in Congress, and that didn't happen. And so we come to 2012. And we were able, as a campaign, to look at some internal data, which is very different from the external data. You may remember, if you look at a lot of these different reports, you would have thought in October, after Obama bombed in Colorado, remember the first debate, and did okay in the second and third debate, particularly the third debate when he started giving Romney a hard time. It's very interesting. Romney was still ahead in the polls but in fact, our data show that the Obama campaign did in 2012 what it did in 2008. The ground game was incredible. That is, that they didn't just call you once at your house, but they knew where you lived, what kind of car you drove, what you ate for dinner, who you were married to, who you were having a relationship with if you weren't married. They knew everything about folks. And then they also knew how to get the vote out for 2012. Romney's, not criticism, but just factually, the Romney folks were reading the headlines that had him ahead and said, we're going to win this. And in fact, the numbers turned out to be just the opposite, that the groundwork made all the difference in terms of what happened in 2012. Now, what's interesting about these two issues, the biggest interest point is this. If you look at the numbers from 2008 to 2012, the African-American turnout for Obama in 2012 was higher than in 2008. That makes no sense at all. I didn't say that. I'm just repeating what somebody else said. That makes no sense at all, right? When you think about what has happened to the African-American community from 2008 to 2012, the support was overwhelming. I'll give you one example from this state. The sort of cognitive dissonance of what's happening in a state like Florida. You remember all the changes in laws between 2008 and 2012, a lot of them in 2010 when Republicans took a lot of seats because Obama wasn't on the ballot in 2010, and African-American community did not vote in the midterm elections. In 2012, here in Florida, the ministers had one Sunday that they could take all their members to vote, and that was part of the early voting. It was only one Sunday in all the early voting. And as a result of that, what they did was, and I've been going to church since birth and a devout Christian, but I've never in my life seen a minister anywhere in the country in a sermon on time. There were no church after 1 o'clock. I mean, if it said 1 o'clock, oh, I gotta go, right? And it was called Souls, S-O-U-L-S, Souls to the Polls. And nonpartisan, you can vote for whoever you want to, but you know who they're talking about, right? And so all these hundreds of people were going out and voting early in October, and we don't know who they voted for until we found out, oh, Obama, oh, what a surprise, right? And it wasn't just the churches, but then you saw students from HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities around the country, going to polls in very large numbers on their own, organized that. And Daytona Beach, there was a massive gathering of folks there. In Washington, D.C., all these places where HBCUs were, they were marching as a group of students who had heard something or listened to something, and they were going out and supporting Obama in 2012. Even though it's hard to imagine what was done. Now, I can go through the list, $787 billion in support, economic support in the first term, Obama, the health care in the first term, the Pell Grants for students in the first term, and also promised in the second terms. I mean, all these things you see, the benefits for military veterans, I mean, a host of things that you can see that were being done that the president tried to do that made a big difference as well. And the turnout was quite impressive. And then you take a look at 2012, you're wondering what impact did the voter ID laws have on Barack Obama in 2012? The answer is marginal, because Obama won a number of those states, Romney won a number of those states, and there was no remarkable difference. Those who had stricter voter ID laws requiring some identification, Romney won. Those who had looser voter ID laws, Obama won. And so it wasn't what people thought was going to be a landslide. And so it made an enormous amount of difference. Romney won Kansas, Georgia, Tennessee, and Indiana. They all required a photo ID in order to vote. And yet Obama won a number of states as well that didn't require a photo ID. Or had some photo ID that didn't have the same kind of conditions. and it made an enormous amount of difference. And so you could see the difference in how people were responding. And so has Obama talked about race much at all in the second term? And the answer is no, and then perhaps maybe. And I'll give a couple of examples. He didn't mean to talk about it, but he talked about it in 2009 because I was then representing Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. You may remember he was arrested in his house after showing both his Harvard ID first and then his driver's license. He was still arrested, mainly because the police officer thought he was arrogant, which is not a crime. Right, and so Obama said the Cambridge police acted stupidly when they arrested a man in his own house after showing ID, and there was a backlash, a huge backlash that led to the beer summit that you may remember. The beer wasn't that good, but you know. And then the second time that was even more pronounced was again here in Florida, was the killing of Trayvon Martin. He was quiet for a couple of weeks, but then he finally did say, had a press conference and had made a statement about Trayvon Martin. And he said, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. And that was the first sort of concrete way in which he's dealt with race. Rush Limbaugh went off and said, well, what if your son were white? You wouldn't be doing this, et cetera. And so it became very interesting the way he looked at it, but he's been very careful about not doing that. And he said in a Rolling Stone article, he says, well, you know, are you going to do anything for the black community? And he said then what he would say today, I'm not in this to do something for a particular group. I'm here to do something for all the American people. And I think if I have a jobs bill, it's going to benefit everybody. If I have a health care, it's going to benefit everybody. It may disproportionately benefit people who are poor and black. But this is not a black bill. I'm not the president. I'm not the black president. I'm the president who happens to be black. And that became clear in both what we heard. African Americans were seeing him as the black president, different from Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and others who ran. And whites were seeing him as raceless, that we don't see race. And both supported Obama. And so he's carried that in a very powerful way. And let me end by saying this about whether we're post-racial. The answer is, I don't think so. I think we still have to deal with it. And it's not really post-racial. I don't think there's possibility of having a post-racial society. I think there's possibility of having a post-racist society. And I think we can achieve that through what we need to do. But it's going to require some work. And I believe, and I'll end here because I know I'm going late, I'll end here. I believe in the idea that we heard from Thurgood Marshall before, and that is the idea of this is not a melting pot where you leave your identity, whatever that ethnic or racial or gender identity may be, you don't lose it. He said he believed in a salad bowl theory, and Thurgood Marshall talked about the salad bowl theory. That is, if you look at a salad bowl, it has lettuce and tomatoes and carrots and cucumbers and a whole host of things. They don't lose their vitality or individuality, but they're part of a salad that makes all of it work. And I think that's what makes it happen. So as we talk about post-racial society, that is a misnomer in terms of what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve one that's inclusive of every different pedigree, every different type of diversity, because that's what's important. And I think that if we think about what this president has done or will do, it's not so much to be the first president who happens to be black, but a president who understands his role is to serve all the people, even if it means that he's going to have some dissension among the African American community. I'm going to stop there, and I'll take some questions now. Thank you. Questions?
Anybody have any questions? I'm going to give you a microphone. Unless you have a loud voice like me.
Yes. Yeah.
Here, we'll give you the mic.
I don't even
Maybe not.
It's on.
So it's estimated that 2.3 million Americans are incarcerated
Yep.
right now. Out of that number, 1 million are African Americans. When you juxtapose that to the importance, which I think is unfathomable of having President Barack Obama as the president, having Eric Holder as the first African-American Attorney General. The importance, again, unfathomable, but the effect on a whole generation of youth where they think their destiny is just by numbers to end up in jail because of, statistically speaking. Do you think the effect offsets of President Obama's election? Do you think it offsets?
I think the view of the African American community of the president's attitude toward criminal justice matters is one that expresses great disappointment. The mass incarceration and the drug war are examples that have disproportionately affected the African American community without a real resolution. And I think that's going to be part of his legacy. I think, and I've said this before, it's going to be hard to evaluate his legacy until 50 years from now. We can't tell. And what they will say, I won't speak for them, they will say, well, hey, we got bin Laden. That's good. I think that's great. But you have to also recognize that at home, it's a very depressing and disappointing program. I've been one who've been opposed to the idea that started with the Clinton administration, but continued with the Obama administration, the whole powder, crack, cocaine disparity, which was 100 to 1, and the Obama administration reduced it from 18 to 1, from 100 to 1. That's still discrimination. That may have alleviated some of the problem, but it hasn't solved the problem. And I think that is an eyesore in terms of what will be remembered. And people will remember terror, they remember all these focuses on other things, but the reality is that we have three things. We have an unprecedented number of African Americans incarcerated. Michelle Alexander says in her book, there are more African American men in jail right now than when there was legal slavery, right? That tells you the point. The unemployment rate is not his fault, but it's on his watch. Unemployment rate has doubled. And nothing's been done that focuses on the African American communities. Education, while we can talk about what's happening at people who are in these universities and colleges, et cetera, and graduate schools, the reality is that things are suffering K through 12 across, particularly in public education. And folks are running to charter schools, running to private schools, running to anything, going to the suburbs, anything that will, as a right, a parent should. I told 20 years ago, my kids were younger, they were teenagers and preteens who were talking about, we have to solve the education problem. We need to have a longer school day and a longer school year. And they said, Dad, cool out, man, what you doing? Don't be saying that. Now they're adults with children and they understand that a parent has to do those sorts of things. That makes an enormous amount of difference. So that is part of the legacy. When I said, you can talk about things that are good things, you can't ignore the things that I've talked about: unemployment, education, and public safety. Those things have been a problem from the Attorney General's point of view, that office, and from the White House. Yes.
Sorry, I just arrived, Charles. It's great to see you.
How are you?
Look, along those lines, if you had the presidency here, what macro policy would you recommend that we should try to implement relative to urban areas, particularly the Black American, unemployment, and others? Because as you know, frankly, there has been no macro policy approach to those issues. It's a dire situation. So if you had this here, what would you propose?
Well, what I would do, the president loves a lot of people, but he loves Abraham Lincoln. He loves Martin Luther King, right? And my sense is that if there's one thing that I would recommend, and that is a comprehensive jobs program, right? Put people to work, because if that happens, that means you have a place to live. That means you have a meal. That means kids go to school having eaten the morning before. That means parents can assess what happens. And public education has been a failure. Race to the top is a good idea, and it's made some benefits in some communities because people are adopting the procedure even if they don't get the money from the Secretary of Education. So that, to me, jobs means housing, jobs means concern about children's education, because no one's going to move to a place if you don't have good schools, K through 12. That's unfair to your children. And so and I've had his ear, and I've been saying that. And the reality is that the response is, well, I don't create jobs. That's done by the legislative branch. But there's a bully pulpit. And presidents have used the bully pulpit to make it known that I am very concerned about this, and if you don't do something, I will. Here's the bill, and here's what I think should happen, even if Congress goes in a different way. So I think that has to be, there has to be an attitude. And when I say it's going to be 50 years for his legacy, I'm thinking about Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson had Martin Luther King Jr. as his nemesis, but his partner. Johnson said, bring me the problem in America in the 60s, and I will try to fix it. And that's why we have the 64 Civil Rights Act. That's why we have the 65 Voting Rights Act. I mean, the whole idea was the president is responding to pressure, and Lyndon Baines Johnson said, and he was right, he says, I'm doing these things, but because of that, we Democrats, will probably lose the South. He was right about that. But we would never have had the 65 Voting Rights Act, the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 68 Public Accommodations Act, the 68 Fair Housing Act. And you think about it, it was Johnson who appointed in 1967 Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court, right? I mean, that tells you something. That's very early, when the first woman was not appointed until 1981, when Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed by Reagan. But that begins to tell you something. Yeah. Yeah.
Relative to most of the legislation that's being passed, say, for example, the Dodd-Frank Act, Obamacare, however you want to carry it right. What's in those particular pieces of legislation for these law students to find employment? Because there's been a tremendous downsizing of the legal community, and these kids are graduating here with enormous debt. Someone needs to hear their complaints.
Well, let me answer that in a variety of ways. First, I completely believe that we are charging absolutely too much for legal education and not guaranteeing jobs for people who It is despicable and unacceptable. It's just unacceptable in terms of what we're trying to do. And in that vein, my sense is I'm teaching different courses. One thing about tenure, you can do what you want to do. And so I'm not teaching, with respect to the dean, I'm not teaching the traditional courses that first and second year students teach. I'm teaching a course on revitalizing America's cities. That's the game for the 21st century. What are we going to do to save cities? And it's education, it's jobs, it's housing, and it's employment, and it's public safety. No one's going to move into a neighborhood that doesn't have those factors. And that's how we've changed. I'm teaching a course on the HBO series, The Wire. Right? So The Wire, what does that have to do with law? Everything, right? It's about education, jobs, housing, and public safety. It has all those things, and people are beginning to see that you have to teach things. And I'm telling my students that when I graduated from law school in 1978, I had the choice to go to a law firm in California, where I'm from, or go work with a public defender in Washington, D.C., where my heart led me. And the salary of the law firm in 1978, I don't want to embarrass young people by this, the salary for the law firm was $18,000. The salary at the public defender's office was $15,000. I had a wife and a child, and it was a little bit complicated. But the reality is that I could do it. I could see doing public service, and I think that has to be that. And I say it's beyond the jobs you mentioned. People should think about working for a governor, a mayor, a superintendent of schools, superintendent of police. I mean, there's a whole host of jobs that are out there. And I'll say this just candidly. You're not going to get a job at the legal aid, at the LDF, Legal Defense Fund in New York. They don't hire people out of law school. They hire people who have 10 years experience at a firm and then want to bring that and get their salary cut by 80%. So it's right, the truth, 90%, I understated it, right? And so I want you to be realistic. You can't go to your prize place, but there are jobs in Tennessee, there are jobs in North Carolina, there are jobs in Minnesota. And most people want to go to New York, Washington, or Los Angeles. There are 47 other states with a lot of cities And I say that because I know my students, 90% or 98%, I said, how many of you going back home? And very few hands went up. And they're from those places that make all of America. And their goals are still New York, Washington, and California, as opposed to, you know, Cincinnati, Cleveland, you know, Omaha, a lot of other places that can use legal skills and desperately need legal skills. And the last thing I'll say this is that Barack Obama was in his 30s when he first got involved in politics. And he was in his 40s when he was running for a national office. I think that our leaders can do that, and our young people can do that in any sense. And that's what he did, because if you look at what he looked like in 2007, he had zero chance. They couldn't even pronounce his name correct, right? But the reality is that look at what he's been able to do. And what I don't want is the impression, which many people have, which may be true, is that only Barack Obama could do this. It's not a Democrat or Republican, but only Barack Obama. I hope that's wrong. My sense is that any organized person can do it, and he had to fail a whole lot of times before he succeeded. And I think that's what people don't see in terms of what needs to be done. I think I have time for one more question or two more questions.
Maybe make a student, we have a student over here.
Oh, great, terrific.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Ian Ward, president of the Black Law Student Association here. Thank you for coming out. You mentioned earlier that Barack Obama was a community organizer and he had a gift to unify his class, and they tended to gravitate towards him. But we found during the first term in the election, when he first was elected during the first term, he was incredibly divisive from Congress to the country. Even with all his gifts, why do you think there was that division in our country?
I think that's a very good question. I think part of it is second, you know, you can have a second guess now. I think that he tried to use the skills that made him a great community organizer and a great president of Harvard Law Review and a great state senator to deal with hard-level, hard-nosed politics. And folks aren't interested in being collaborative. They're not interested in reaching across the aisle. It's very different. And that's why he's had such a tough time. And I think that if you look at somebody like Lyndon Baines Johnson, it's 50 years now, you can look and see the things that he did that made a big difference. Right, because he didn't care about his party as much as he cared about his people, and his people were all the country. And the reality is that it's not that he was saying, I need the black vote. The black vote was so small. But Barack Obama has to be tough and mean and get things done and not look for praise or support from other organizations as well. So I think that makes an enormous amount of difference. And that's what I hope he will do. If he doesn't do it, I think as we grade and evaluate the president, it's going to be very complicated. Other student questions? You had one. And with the blue shirt, because I saw you earlier. Yes. You know you have one. It was a good question earlier today.
Hello, how you doing? My name is Garcendi, third-year law student. Well, look, when we were talking earlier, I had given you an account as to why I decided to go to law school, because in my early years, in my 20s, I had been pulled over by police officers so many times. I've had guns drawn out on me and these different scenarios. So my question to you was, what suggestions do you have for law students when dealing with police officers and things of that nature?
It's a very good question, and I'm glad you raised it here too, because my sense is that your experiences aren't different from a lot of people of color in any community in America. And you would think that it's not happening in 21st. It is. We're not post-racial. We still are there. And the police, whether they're black, white, men, or women, have the same views. I said I have a lot of family members who are in law enforcement. I'm not critical of law enforcement just because they're law enforcement. But there's a bond there that they see you in one way. And my sense is that I think everybody needs to take a look at what happened just a little bit more of a year ago, not in Florida, not in California, not in Illinois, but in the state of New York, in the city of Brooklyn. police were stopping people stopping them and searching them without any cause. They didn't have a weapon. They weren't suspects. And it was approved by the mayor, a good mayor, a progressive mayor, Mayor Bloomberg. And if it happens in New York, think about Alabama, think about Florida, think about, I don't mean to use the same names, Mississippi, but I mean, the reality is that that becomes part of the problem. And I think in terms of a community, there is a community here. People will need to share, well, you know what, I had just a different, and I've heard this in my class. White students will come up in a discussion like this, wow, I had just a different experience with officers, so-and-so, because I was drinking, I was having a party, and they said, put your bottle down, you don't drink anymore, go home, etc. No arrests, no handcuffs, no ID. And you know who told this story as well? Tim Wise. Tim Wise has a new book coming out, he has a new series, and he talked about that he had left his keys in the car, mistakenly, and that locked the door. And he says he had this device trying to break the window open, and the police officer pulled over and said, sir, let me help you. And it just occurred to him, the officer never thought that he was breaking into a car, and he wasn't. But the whole idea was, let me help you, because this is how you hold the device, unlatch it. And then there you go, a good day. Never asked for ID, never asked if it was his car. And good thing it was, but he made that instant connection in terms of race. And that's what happens now. There's a video I think you may see. Well, I should have shown it. I'm not going to show the video here. But there's a video that has the context of that, where they have a white kid, a teenager, appearing to be cutting a lock on a bike to steal a bike. And the people are walking by, they're looking, and they keep going. A black kid is doing that, and a guy stops him. Another guy is taking pictures of it. Another guy's calling the police on the phone, right? I mean, it's very interesting the way they're seeing it. This is on a video about implicit bias. Just what they see. And it's not that they don't see a person cutting a lock to get a bike. They see a black and they see a white, and they view it differently because their mind is telling them, this is a crime, and this is, it's probably his bike. They've already calculated it's probably his bike, right? And so that's part of it. And my sense is that people in your community need to have those stories about how they're treated differently. And you don't have to say it's you that was drinking. Say, a friend of mine, a neighbor, a cousin, Uncle Bud. But I think those are, I mean, the things happen in law are reality, and that's why sometimes it's hard for us to teach a class. We say, that's not what happened. They don't believe in stop and frisk. They don't believe in the Fifth Amendment. They do, but they'll find a way around it if they can get around it. And that's a good example. But I would say share that video of what happened in Brooklyn, because that shows how race matters, and show the video implicit bias of what happens with the bike. It shows that race matters. And I think that, and the fact that we elected Barack Obama doesn't mean that we are in at the campaign. Do you have a question in the back? Yep.
What role do HBCUs have in a post-racial society?
Yeah, that's very interesting. The one thing about HBCUs are historically black colleges and universities. And they were opened in the late 1800s and some in the 1900s for this reason. They admitted everybody, without regard to race. And there's no, you can only go to Harvard or Howard or Fisk or Morehouse if you're black. That's no longer the case. That's just not the case. And they are the diversifying elements, and they open up their doors. And they still have a role, because you know what? There's a lot of folks, like women's colleges have a role and men's colleges have a role, because you're trying to make sure that you educate a certain community. You can look at that and decide it's not going to work, but I see them having a very valuable role. And I get every year, and it makes a place like Harvard understand that you need to have people from Howard and from Morehouse and from Spelman and from Fisk and from Florida A&M, because it diversifies it. You know, one of the great things that I see in my classroom that makes a difference, the folks who've gone to HBCUs come to a place like Harvard. Many of them are black, if not all of them are black. They come to Harvard with the expectation that they can do well. Where do they learn that? Spelman, not at Harvard. At Morehouse, not at Harvard. At Fisk, at FAMU, not at Harvard. They come in because they can't use the excuse of race. Well, I didn't do well because the teacher didn't like me because I was black. Well, the teacher was black. Everybody in the class was black. You can't use that, and they learn how to do it well. And that's what Charles Hamilton Houston, who I mentioned originally, that's what he did at Howard, teaching them, Thurgood Marshall's skills were way above any other normal lawyer because he learned it in the classroom and he also learned it in the streets. And I think the combination of what you learn in the book and what you learn in real life makes you a better lawyer. And that's why when he fought and integrated the University of Maryland, it's no surprise that he did that. He didn't want to go to Maryland that much, but he wanted Maryland to be open for other folks. He didn't want to go to Harvard, where I went, but I couldn't have gone to Harvard or Stanford if it had not been for the HBCUs pushing for opportunities for others. They didn't care what your GPA was or how you did on the SAT or LSAT. It didn't matter because you weren't allowed. And it's because of people pushing to open up all the doors that made an enormous amount of difference. So I think HBCUs still have a role in the 21st century, and I hope they will remain that way. I don't see them becoming extinct because we've solved the problem. Why? Because the brother just reminded us that we still have the problem of living in a post-race society that still, in a sense, weighs race, and I think in some unfair and unfortunate ways. Great, thank you very much.
And from the law school community, we have a plaque in recognition of today's events, recognizing Professor Ogletree for his outstanding contributions to the development of law, to legal scholarship, and the pursuit of justice. Please join me in thanking him one more time. So we will mail this to you.
You can add it to your collection of 701